back to On the Mind. I'm Austin.
I'm Duncan.
I'm Bryce.
How are you? Today we're going to be talking about 3 different topics. A little throwback there. We're going to be talking about international topic, a national topic, and a local or state topic. That's going to be our format, I think, for a little while here. So for our international topic, we're going to go back to a country that we all have an unusual interest in and we'll always have in the podcast. So go ahead and talk about Venezuela, Duncan.
Okay, so as any of you who have actually seen our episode on Venezuela already will know, it's been in a state of economic collapse for, at this point, several years. The commodities crash of 2015 hit it very, very hard. It's also been in a semi-state of political unrest with President Nicolas Maduro effectively consolidating power to himself. And that was actually taken a step further this week when the courts, which historically have been very pro-Maduro, decided that the legislature was, because of 3 seats that were occupied by people from the district, I believe it was Amazonas was the district, 3 people who had been accused by the Maduro administration of electoral fraud were occupying these seats in the assembly. The High Court of Venezuela decided to strip the legislature of all of its power and reassign them partially to itself, partially to the executive branch. The result was an absolute fiasco. The Venezuelan people, who are already incredibly fed up with the government that is currently in place in Venezuela, organized protests. In fact, Maduro's own Attorney General, Luisa Ortega, even went so far as to break with President Maduro on this and call for protests herself, which is very unprecedented within the context of the Venezuelan government.
Right, you think dictatorial figures would stick together.
Apparently, Ortega doesn't much care for the dictatorial bent that Maduro is taking.
You know, it kind of makes sense from an attorney general standpoint to say, hey, we need to stick within the law.
Right, and the Constitution of Venezuela, in fairness to Ortega's position, specifically forbade this sort of thing from occurring.
Okay, that makes even more sense to me. But let's go ahead and talk about how Maduro softly backed out of this.
Yeah, in a moment of brief lucidity where he realized that effectively his administration was not strong enough, not popular enough to handle this situation, he ordered the court to review the decision. Now, in real terms, what that is Maduro telling the court to reverse the decision.
Do you think Maduro figured out by himself that he wasn't popular, or did somebody have to tell him?
Well, I don't think he's anything like Trump, per se, in this, at least, ego category. So we're going to go ahead and say he just looked outside the window.
And saw the millions of angry, starving...
Now, actually, that's a funny twist here, because, in fact, had Maduro looked outside his window, he would have seen nothing, because during the protests in Caracas, what he decided to do was deploy the military onto the streets to confine the protesters to the external areas of the city rather than get them into the city center, which is where most of Venezuela's government buildings are. So, in reality, you had this very tense situation with a mob that admittedly was mostly peaceful, but definitely could have been turned from that with fairly minor provocation, and the Venezuelan military sort of rubbing along with a great deal of friction in the same place at the same time. And it's really quite remarkable that this didn't turn into a worse situation than it did.
So all in all, this will be something to keep your eye on for the next little bit.
For about the next 2 weeks, because I think we could still see more repercussions from this specifically. We could also perchance see Maduro attempt to wrest control from the legislature, which is, this is one thing that we probably should have mentioned earlier, is that the legislature is primarily made up of a majority of opponents to Maduro.
Yeah, I think you mentioned
Right, the opposition party. I think that may have been before we started recording.
You talked about how the Amazonas district...
Right.
And how they were... Anyway, we'll just
Correct.
go ahead and...
But the majority party in the legislature is actually the opposition to Maduro, which is why this whole thing sort of came to be.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on, I think, unless you guys want to elaborate more.
No, I'm good. I don't have anything to say.
So, Bryce, tell me what's going down in Hawaii.
Okay, so lawmakers in Hawaii have introduced a bill that would grant doctors the ability to prescribe housing for homeless Medicaid, what's the word I'm looking for?
Recipients?
Recipients, there we go. So what is it? The housing is expected to cost around $20,000 annually. This is sort of thing has been introduced already in a town in Alberta, Canada, and housing there costs $35,000 annually. In Hawaii, the average homeless Medicaid recipient costs around $95,000 annually. The idea is that you get these people in houses, they will go to the emergency room less, and then eventually they will be able to get back on their feet where they are not needing Medicaid and not needing public housing. It's a brand new thing in the States. Nobody else has tried it before. I don't know if any one of you guys want to chip in now.
I'm sure Duncan has plenty to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, even though as a financial matter, it does make some sense with regards to potentially saving some money, I think that this opens the door to a host of ramifications that these people are not thinking through at all. Once you take the nation's medical care system, the public funded medical care system that we have, and start opening it up to things that are just manifestly non-medical in nature, I think what you've created is a situation in which, assuming a doctor says this person could probably use this, almost anything, any expense, no matter what anyone else may happen to think of it, can be written as a prescription. And I realize that this particular law deals only with housing. However, I think that creates a precedent for something that we should not be opening up our medical system to.
It's a slippery slope.
It absolutely is.
The town in Alberta, that started in 2008 or 9, and between there and 2015, the homeless issue or homelessness dropped 16%. So these people got out of the public housing, and I'm assuming they got jobs and are now paying taxes. And from what I could read, it didn't seem like any of those people were off Medicaid, or maybe their equivalent of such, but even still, I mean, it seems like it saved the state a little bit of money on that.
Universal health care.
Now, in that situation, I have to ask.
My mistake.
It does.
Okay.
But in that particular situation, with regards to the town in Alberta, are you aware of whether or not that was prescribed as a medical matter through Canada's national healthcare system, or was it an entirely separate organization?
Oh, that was a separate.
And see, that's where my big problem with this comes in, is once you start calling things that are just manifestly not medical in nature part of medical care, there really is no end to where that could potentially, especially since we consider that Medicare and Medicaid are actually federally funded programs where the money is actually distributed by the states according to their own laws. You could have a situation where effectively any welfare program that any state wanted to put into place could be justified through, and funded, mind you, through federal dollars spent on Medicare or Medicaid, as opposed to actually funding individual programs. And that's where I see the biggest problem with this.
Interesting. The reasoning behind it, doctors and the lawmakers themselves were using this term chronic homelessness. Most of these people themselves had many mental disorders, as well as physical disorders as well. And they kept using that term, and they were saying that different organizations have deemed homelessness itself as a sort of disease when the people can't find work, because it's sort of like they can't find work because they're homeless, and they're homeless because they can't find work. We know that almost, I'm going to say maybe 99% of the time, that's probably not the case, but I don't know if you guys have anything.
Well, sorry, Austin, did you have? Well,
No, go ahead.
And my counter to that would be, where does what is a disease end? If you start counting homelessness as something that should be dealt with medically, I mean, is poverty a disease? Should doctors be able to write a prescription that says this person needs a check for $1,200 once a month? Here.
I can see what you're saying, that it could easily become a slippery slope. However, these are bills that are being voted on within the state legislature, and they naturally have a lot of opposition. I would see that I can see that if hypothetically this does pass, anything more to that would just get even more opposition and would not be able to pass, especially in a situation where if this doesn't do well and then ends up costing the state more and more money.
Well, it wouldn't cost the state money, really.
Right, that's the problem, is the state in this case is spending federal dollars that are and it's not even discretionary.
If it was a local thing, like in Alberta, and it was just confined to one city or one county or something, and it was used as an experiment using local dollars, that's fine. However, even then, it's probably going to get a lot of opposition because of the cost, which would still be high. It'd be $25,000 per person.
But of course,
minimum.
The issue is that these states can do this without ever actually seeing the expense direct. Now they'll still see the expense because everyone in those states is taxed on payroll tax to pay for Medicare, but the state budget itself will not see that.
Well, this all being said, homelessness itself is an extremely expensive issue, as well as Medicaid itself, and this is a means to a beginning, not so much a means to an end, whereas it's the beginning of trying to get these people off this government assistance. I can very easily see your points of view. I think it makes sense to at least experiment on it more.
To expand on something you talked about before the podcast is the unique nature of this. How you'd never seen anything like it.
To the best of my knowledge, using a medical welfare program to provide housing is, of course, there are many countries that have housing assistance and have medical assistance programs separately, but to the best of my knowledge, using a medical welfare program for housing subsidization is unique.
Well, the idea is that doctors will be able to say that being homeless is causing this person to come to the emergency room more than is actually necessary. So these are trained professionals making a case-by-case call.
Even under those circumstances, I think we can look at the medical industry right now and see plenty of cases of overprescription, mistaken prescription. Doctors, as well as they are trained, make mistakes.
I'll give you that one. That's a great argument.
And you know what? It happens all the time, and it's not the fault of an individual doctor.
Isn't that why they have to get malpractice insurance?
Right. But when you open up a program like Medicaid to pay for something like housing that is just so completely out of the scope of what the program is intended to do, I think that you're opening Pandora's box, and you have to live with the ramifications of that, not just in the immediate present, but what the precedent is used to pass 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. And all of that costs money.
Well, you got anything else?
No, I see his point of view, and I see my point of view, and I just think it'll be interesting to look at, and I'm not very strong-footed in my position. I'm just, watching with a bowl of popcorn.
Yeah, I would be far more interested instead of disturbed if it was, local money instead of federal.
I will say this. I hope that if they do pass this, that they actually publish the relevant economic data on a year-by-year basis, because that will be very interesting reading.
Indeed it will. Let's go ahead and move on to the state or local section of this.
Some really interesting stuff here.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're going to talk about the bill in Illinois to pass a $15 per hour minimum wage, which I'm sure Duncan has a few essays prepared. And then we also brought up the fact that marijuana is up to be voted on for recreational use.
Correct.
Wow, that's insane. Is it even... I think there's a few places where it's sold for medical use right now.
Yes.
Or it's going to be soon. So let's go ahead and start with the $15 an hour minimum wage. I'm going to go ahead and start off this one since you guys have both had your own topics here. We're going to go ahead and start off by saying, excluding Chicago, there's not a ton of developed economic areas in Illinois.
A small handful, sir. And, of course, Illinois, for those of you who don't live here, is one of the most diverse places economically in the country, because we've got places with, 3 or 4 houses and a bar that count as towns, and then we've got the great metropolitan area of Chicago, of course.
Right, and then there's plenty of college towns, east, East, West, and South Illinois universities all get quite a few.
Right.
Bloomington,
Bloomington, we live in
Normal,
Peoria, which is
Bradley and
a
ICC.
mid-sized city, basically.
Right, even though it's probably going to get smaller and smaller.
Our population has been growing, though, hasn't it, the past year or two?
Yeah.
Even,
Well,
I mean,
what's-
steadily forever, pretty much.
I'm talking about as far as
it's
tax
kind of-
revenue to
Right.
tax spending is going to need to be for infrastructure and such. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the ramifications that it's going to have on the more rural areas.
Do you want me to go first, or do you want Bryce to go first?
Oh boy, let's just go ahead and get you.
Okay, so, as much as I do believe this is well-intentioned, and don't get me wrong, I think that most people who advocate for this kind of minimum wage hike are well-intentioned, but do not fully think through the economic meaning of what they are doing. When you raise the minimum wage by such a vast amount, and granted this is going to be over, I believe it's a 6-year period.
I didn't read.
Yeah, it's like a 50 cent a year
I'm not
increase.
familiar either, but I know what you're saying.
So even though it is spanned out over some time, it's hardly enough time for the market, especially in less developed areas, to try to absorb that. So what you're actually going to be doing is putting smaller businesses downstate, mid-sized businesses in places like Peoria that may demand, work from people who might work for, say, $10 or $12 an hour. You're going to be putting the strain more on those businesses than on the larger businesses, which that's usually what these are meant to tackle. So not only are you increasing the cost of goods and services for the businesses that actually remain, you're making it harder to start up new businesses, you're making it harder for newer businesses that may not be quite as well established to stay afloat. Ultimately, what you're doing is you're putting a strain on the institution that produces all of the value in a given economy, which is business enterprise.
Any counterpoints, Bryce?
Sure. You have more people making more money. They are going to spend said money, and that, of course, goes into the businesses. And then naturally with wage hikes, you also get price hikes to a slower degree, typically, I would imagine. And so I think that it's just going to make the businesses, in the long run, more money. Short term, it'll cost them.
You're also introducing an incentive to automate as much as possible. So the real minimum wage is always $0. $0.00 is the absolute minimum that a human being can make, because that's the minimum wage of being unemployed. If the legal minimum wage is $15 an hour, what you set up is an equation in which any value between 0.00 and 15.00 is automatically compressed down to the point of 0. In other words, anyone whose economic value output is less than $15 an hour, and in reality it's actually closer to like $15.50 because of payroll taxes and insurance costs and stuff like that. But anyone who produces less value than that, A, will not retain their job, and B, if they're kind of close to that range, like let's say they produce $16 an hour worth of value, the comparative advantage of automating their job becomes vastly higher. And we've actually seen this in places that have done what we're proposing to do, which is the $15 an hour minimum wage. Seattle, San Francisco, almost as soon as the $15 an hour minimum wage was put into legislation in those places, fast food chains, most prominently McDonald's, actually spent the money to fully automate their ordering processes by the time that minimum wage kicked in. People who otherwise would have been employed lost their jobs, and also lost the potential of new job creation in the future to the fact that the government mandated that a company pay more than these jobs were worth.
However, I will say that, take my job for instance, it's maintenance.
Sure.
I have to be there when machines break down.
Sure.
My job likely won't get automated until AI becomes a huge force.
And granted, there are some jobs that are more expensive to automate than others. Your job probably could be automated with infinite amounts of resources. But the thing is, the higher you raise the minimum wage, A, the more likely it is that if there is available technology that can automate your job, that it will be purchased. And B, you're also creating an increased demand in the economy for the development of new technologies from other businesses that can automate the position that you're working in.
You're raising your hand, Bryce. I'm calling
Yes.
on you.
Okay.
Bryce Stilson.
Counterpoint, those jobs, at some point eventually would be automated anyway, no matter what the minimum wage is. Also, if people are making less than what is considered a living wage, then they are on typically government assistance of some kind, and we don't want companies paying half of somebody's what they live on. We want the workplace to pay the employee all of what they work on, or they can have a second job or whatever.
I will say that I agree with you. Duncan, you can probably see this too. Every 7 years, computing processing power goes up every 7 years it doubles, right?
Correct.
And that would leave everything 7 years ago to be halved in value, more or less.
Actually, when you consider the addition of new programming features, it's probably considerably less than half.
Absolutely. I'm just being a little generous here.
Sure.
So when you say we're already automating those jobs in Seattle,
Sure.
the price to do that in other states, other regions, will go down considerably in the next 7 years. So I can understand Bryce's position on this a little more. It's going to be automated anyway, probably because the cost is going to be so low, it'd be stupid not to.
At some point, that will become the case. But the problem with these minimum wage jobs, or these minimum wage laws, is that they actually kill off those jobs prior to the point that an economy would have organically reached that point on its own. So, in fact, it's advancing one element of economic development far beyond the organic economic development of the broader economic context, which does not allow the market time to absorb these new ramifications of its own problem.
Absolutely nothing to do with the actual topic. I'm just curious, what would your solution to automation be?
Frankly, my solution to automation is to allow it to progress as it normally would, because one cannot do that without disproportionately impacting the freedoms of businesses. That said, I think that as much as people rail against automation, it's singularly and patently absurd for them to advance policies that actually expedite the speed with which jobs are automated.
Eventually, automation will lead to universal wages.
Universal basic income.
Yeah, that's it. Universal basic income. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where this leads, like what the in-between period will continue to look like in the future. I don't know. I'm just thankful, just like you guys, my job can't necessarily be automated, at least for the time being. So,
I mean, when I say there are a lot of aspects, I cover a lot of different things than just basic maintenance. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to something I'm sure everybody other than me in the room is going to really enjoy. Huh?
I had one more thing to say about
go ahead.
The minimum wage. Is that what you were going to talk about?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. I do agree with Duncan that $15 is too high. I would say maybe in Chicago itself, but for the rest of the state, there's a living wage calculator that's online. You can use that to look up your own county. Our county is pretty similar to most of the state. The idea is that it's a wage, if you're working 40 hours a week, that you can save right around $300 a month and still live off what you need, have the basic essentials, plus $300 a month. So that calculated that for the Peoria County, it would be just over $11 an hour. I myself would be comfortable with a $12 an hour minimum wage over a period of time, getting there slowly.
Right, I think that's something we all agree on, and that's something that I've held for a long time. You can't just change everything in an instant.
Well, I don't agree with increasing the minimum wage, but I agree with you as a general principle, yes.
Okay, so let's just go ahead and move on to something you two are going to enjoy talking about.
Oh, boy.
Recreational marijuana in Illinois.
Woo!
Let me start off by saying that Rauner said he heard real bad things from his Colorado friends, so it's probably not going to get passed. Because, that's a good basis to form an opinion.
Anecdotal evidence, the enemy of actual evidence, yeah.
Okay, so we'll just go ahead and go ahead, you two. I don't even care.
Okay, so there's a bill being passed to legalize recreational use of marijuana in the state of Illinois. Duncan, do you recall what the tax was?
Yes, and that's something I actually want to bring up. But At point of sale, in other words, from a retail seller to a consumer, it has the standard 6.25% sales tax. However, it also has a non-variable $50 per ounce production tax from the wholesale producer, or in other words, the dispensary.
So essentially, it's at that point pretty useless.
Right. And I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just people are still gonna buy from non-retail places, i.e., some guy they know.
Well, and here's the thing that makes this effectively more useless as a means of collecting tax revenue. Now, don't get me wrong. As a libertarian, I firmly believe that a person's body is their own sovereign property. I do not think the state has any business telling anyone what to do or what not to do with their own physical body, including using any drug whatsoever. With that said, as a tax revenue scheme, this is patently idiotic. The reason I say that is because you have the $50 wholesale tax, you have a 6.25% point of sale tax to the consumer that's also going to have to take into account the added price of that $50 per ounce that the wholesaler had to pay. And this bill at the same time allows any private individual over the age of 21 years to grow up to 5 marijuana plants on their own property. In other words, the economic incentive to grow rather than to purchase is going to be, it's just an exponential difference. There's no good incentive to purchase as opposed to growing.
I have to say I'm rather naive on this topic. How much marijuana do 5 marijuana plants produce?
Depending on the hybrid species and depending on the conditions under which they're grown, it does vary pretty widely. I'd say maybe quarter to half a pound if you really, over the course of a full growing season. Sound about right to you guys?
I wouldn't know either.
I know there are some hybrids that can actually produce up to a full pound.
I'm gonna assume that's insane. Let's just talk to me. How is that gonna last you for the entire year?
So a pound is 16 ounces. You have 5, and it's 5 plants at any one time. It's not 5 plants for the year. So let's say you do it in rolling order. You harvest one plant, you have 2 more growing, and then you grow another one. You can continue doing that throughout the course of the year if you want to under this bill.
Okay, the closest comparison in my mind is tobacco.
Yeah.
Can you grow your own tobacco? Tobacco, yeah.
I believe it is actually legal. However, with that said, growing tobacco is much, much, much more difficult than growing cannabis sativa. Just in terms of the conditions it requires. Unlike cannabis, people, who smoke, say, 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day, you would never be able to get through, any sort of prolonged period of time with what you could grow. And the other thing is that cannabis grows relatively well indoor. Obviously, a lot of people grow it inside using grow lights and hydroponic systems. And, realistically, it can be grown in most home environments, whereas tobacco, not that it can't be, you'd need a lot more space to grow a comparatively appreciable amount.
Okay.
Now, say hypothetically somebody had, say, 10 plants growing in their own home. That's not, a prisonable offense, is it?
I don't know actually how this new bill deals with any overages on that. I would assume it would probably substantially reduce. I guess probably a fairly hefty fine would be my assumption.
Also, Duncan, before I forget, something that you love to do is beat the system at its own game. Am I wrong?
Yeah, you are quite right about that.
Okay, so would this not, instead of incentivizing them to buy it, it would incentivize them to buy alternatives? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there is a degree of that too. Certainly.
So they'd have to buy UV lights and hydroponic systems, which that would create a market for that in Illinois.
That is correct.
So still it would be creating a market.
And there would be tax revenue from those, but you have to remember that would exclude the $50 per ounce tax, which that's where this really gets crazy, because the 6.25% sales tax, you pay that on everything. That's not a big deal. However, if the cost that the consumer pays, let me break it down like this. At the dispensary, the stuff is grown and it's sold to a retailer. When the retailer purchases it, it's increased $50 per ounce over the expense of the dispensary to produce it and whatever profit they need to make in order to sustain their own business model. So that's when it arrives at the retail point of distribution. Then the consumer has to pay the profit of both the wholesaler and the retailer, and that's assuming there's no middleman. I'm assuming a direct supply chain on this and being very generous in that. Plus the $50 tax that the retailer had to absorb in cost, plus the cost of the retailer to supply the space in which it is sold, divided out by the number of products and everything. But at every stage of this process, as in all things, more cost is added, but that $50 per ounce cost just drives it way, way, way up over what it would normally be under similar circumstances without that tax.
What does Colorado do? Just curious.
I'm really not sure what their tax system on that is.
Because
I'm sure it's a lot more conservative.
I would imagine they probably do have some kind of production tax on it.
That was my point. Is I wouldn't assume Illinois, knowing how Illinois is, to come up with its own ideas.
This is
So
true.
I'm assuming they just copied and pasted.
No, they took a pretty decent idea that brought in a lot of revenue into the state and made it really crappy.
Okay, so exactly like I'd expect Illinois to be.
Right. And again, this is one of those things that maybe if you put a $5 or a $10 per ounce tax, you would not increase the cost sufficiently to drive most people who would otherwise buy at retail establishments away. But, a $50 tax, I have a question for you guys. If you were going to go buy marijuana at a retail establishment and it was $50 more per ounce than it by all rights should be, would you continue to buy at a retail establishment, or would you buy a couple of pots, some potting soil, a grow light, and maybe if you were feeling extravagant, a hydroponic system, and just grow your own and save the money?
I'd still probably just try to buy from some guy I know, but if times got desperate and it came to that, then yeah, sure, I'd do that. I definitely wouldn't buy for $50 more. This is something that a lot of people do quite often. They'll smoke every single day of their lives.
There are people who smoke multiple ounces per week.
Yes.
Very many of them, in fact.
I still don't see the appeal to all this. It's just the same as before. It's like, I've never been into that sort of thing. And then you're going to say, hey, on top of everything else you have to pay, you have to give the state $50. It's like, I'm just going to stay away from it even more now.
Right. And actually, as Bryce points out, and this is a really great point, if anything, the $50, this is sort of meant to decriminalize marijuana, if you will. But if anything, the $50 tax is actually going to fuel the demand for semi-legal operation. Because, again, this wouldn't be the hard crime that it is now. But certainly if you had someone who was growing 50 marijuana plants in their home and had not registered as a dispensary and gotten the necessary licenses with the state and everything, that person would definitely be subject, at 50 plants, probably to a prison sentence, and I'm sure, at the very least, a very hefty fine. But you'd actually be driving people into that consumer market as opposed to the retail consumer market where taxation was applicable.
Yes.
So wait, tell me, would it be illegal for someone to grow their own plants and then sell them to a retailer?
To the best of my knowledge, as far as the bill is worded, the 5 plants that any adult is able to legally grow must be for personal use.
Okay, well, that's fine. Okay.
And of course, this doesn't deal with our existing medical marijuana statutes, obviously. Those have a slightly different set of rules that, they have a very different purpose, in a sense, than this does. This is only dealing with recreational.
Okay.
Not that I'm sure people on medical marijuana will probably enjoy this, I'm sure, because it will eventually bring the costs down a little bit for them.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, anything else?
No.
All right, so
Just
closing
that
statement.
I'm sad. Closing statements? Oh man, we
well, you
covered
just gave yours.
so much. Okay, so let me go in order. What do we talk about first?
Venezuela.
Venezuela. closing statements for that, man, that's gonna be interesting to watch, and boy, am I happy I don't live in Venezuela. Really any South American country, but especially Venezuela. Okay, then we talked about Hawaii. Again, that'll be interesting to watch. If I were if I were homeless, yeah, I'd move to Hawaii, I guess, for this. I don't know if I could afford the plane ticket. I mean, even now, I don't think I could. But Hawaii's
Swim.
expensive. It's expensive to live in Hawaii. No wonder there's so many homeless people. That was maybe inappropriate. I'm sorry. Let's move on. What was after that? We talked about
$15.
Illinois. Okay. Too high of a raise in the minimum wage, but regardless, I still think it's maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So we still are kind of moving in the right direction, just a little bit too far. And then with the medical marijuana, this is more like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I don't know. At the very least, it seems like it'll be decriminalized. So there's that. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, as for me, Venezuela is, as it has been for the past 2 years, a complete mess. I don't at this point see a situation in which this is resolved simply. Their fiscal issues are so vast that a complete restructuring of the Venezuelan economy is not only necessary, but imminently necessary. And I think the sooner that they do that, the better off they're going to be in the long run. With regards to the issue in Hawaii, if this was a local experiment or even a small regional experiment, I could see some merit in it. I might still disagree with it.
You're stealing my closing statement.
But, as an expansion of Medicaid or Medicare, this does not make any sense because it completely opens the door up to anything and everything being treated as a medical expense when it is just demonstrably not a medical expense. As far as the medical marijuana and the $15 an hour minimum wage, I'll roll my statements into one and just say leave it to Illinois to pursue 2 pieces of poor fiscal policy at the same time. Needless to say, I am very much for the legalization of marijuana. I think the adult United States citizen should have every right to use whatever substance he or she wishes without any fear of criminal penalties. But with that said, if this is being treated as a tax collection scheme, it is perhaps the dumbest tax collection scheme in modern history. Austin, over to you, my friend.
All right, Venezuela. What can I think you were a little generous saying it's only had problems for the past 2 years.
I was talking about when it collapsed.
Okay, never mind. All right, so looking at it this way, I think I don't think interesting was the right word to describe it either. I think it's going to be disturbing to see what happens next. Either way, I think the government's going to collapse. So it's going to be kind of scary to see what kind of crazy crap goes down there. That's all I got to say about Venezuela. I really hope it recovers. Let's go ahead and move on to Hawaii. And this is that's what drug me to Sanders' camp to begin with, is a little more spending now to prevent a lot of spending down the road. Something Bryce brings up quite a bit, actually. So when you put it in that context, yes, I'm all behind it. However, like Duncan said, it's a slippery slope to maybe not. I don't see so much saying everything's going to be turned into a medical definition of an issue. I think it's more going to be people are going to try to find ways to introduce social programs however they can to help whatever they think needs helping, when really we need to taxes should be there for a specific reason, and then when that need's gone, it needs to be phased out. That's something I've always believed in. It's the Keynesian model, right?
Correct.
So when you talk about a vague area being taxed by a vague program that is left to state discretion, it makes me scratch my head a little. And anyway, we're going to move on to the $15 an hour minimum wage. Could this work in Chicago? Hell yeah, it could. Would it work in Chicago? Probably. Will it work for the rest of Illinois? Not at that level, even if it's phased in slowly. It's just we're too rural. Even small cities can't handle $15 an hour, really.
I don't think Peoria could handle it.
Well, not anymore, at least.
I don't think even when Caterpillar was
its prime,
booming,
yeah.
I don't think we could have handled that.
Or the equivalent at the time.
Well, right, obviously adjusting for inflation.
Right. So that's a cause for concern. Would I like to see living standards go up for everybody? Yeah. Am I an economist? No. So let's go ahead and move on to medical marijuana. I have to tell you, I honestly just don't care about marijuana at all. I understand that a lot of people. Yeah. Okay, bring it on.
Boo.
Well, there's a whole bunch of thumbs down that just hit this video. So, no, I don't care. I understand a lot of my friends are huge into it. I wish people would stop talking about how it's a medical wonder. I can understand how it might make people feel better, but I don't see how people can say, hey, it makes you feel better, to, hey, it cures cancer, without the proper research. So would I like to be able to see it researched? Sure. Do I want it to be legal and everywhere? Yeah, I think that should be right for anyone over the age of 21. I think the war on drugs is ridiculous. But with the tax scheme Illinois has planned for it, I think it's destined to fail. It's just going to increase criminal operation, and I'm going to have this conversation again in about a year when they try to reform it. But anyway, that's all that's on the mind. I'm Austin.
I'm Duncan.
I'm Bryce.
Thanks for joining us. If you like the video, please hit that like button. And if you want more content from us in the future, make sure to subscribe. We have a Facebook page linked below, and
Don't forget also, if there's a topic you'd like to hear us talk about, leave a comment in the description. At this point, we are small enough and desperate enough, we will talk about whatever you want.
We will even strip on microphone for you. You
Bryce
can't
will.
see it.
Bryce will, yeah.
You can't see it, but we'll do it.
He'll make a lot of rustling sounds. Anyway, thanks for joining us.
Good night.